I am curious that, a preemptive strike must strike the Israelis as highly unsavory. And it seems like they would pursue any other option, like regime change in Tehran, before they reach that eventuality. But it seems like pursuing these other options also makes the Iranians much more desperate and much more aggressive towards the Israelis. How do you think they're thinking about this issue?
Yeah, well, there is oftentimes when it comes to counterproliferation strategies, talk about regime change. And the idea is if you can turn a country into a liberal democracy, they won't want nuclear weapons. Last time I looked, the United States was a liberal democracy. We have nuclear weapons. India is a liberal democracy. It has nuclear weapons. Britain is a liberal democracy. It has nuclear weapons. France is a liberal democracy. It has nuclear weapons. It doesn't matter what your political system is. If you're in a bad neighborhood, you just want nuclear weapons in almost all cases. And it's not because you're evil. It's because they are the ultimate deterrent. So I don't think regime change is going to solve the problem. The Americans, as you know, this is somewhat off the subject, we're obsessed with regime change, right? The idea is that we can run around the world, topple a regime, put somebody else in place of the existing regime, and we're all going to live happily ever after. This is like Putin. Oh, if we could only get rid of Putin. I don't have time to get into this. I think that anybody you get who replaces Putin is likely to be worse than him from your point of view. That is, you people who want regime change. I learned my lesson when I was very young, 1963, when we effected regime change in Vietnam. We helped kill President Diem. And the end result is massive instability. Couldn't find anybody to replace Diem, who was no day at the beach, mind you. But anyway, we couldn't find anybody who was even as good as him. And no accident, on March 8th, 1965, the Marines landed Da Nang and we're off to the races because Vietnam is going down the tubes and we have to rescue the South Vietnamese. That's when I learned my lesson. Don't get in the business of regime change, at least if you're thinking that it's going to improve your strategic situation. So I don't think that matters. The Israelis are trying that. They're trying all these other things like Stuxnet and so forth and so on. It doesn't work. If you're determined to get nuclear weapons, you're going to get nuclear weapons. This is what we figured out regarding the Soviet Union. It's what the Soviets and the Americans figured out regarding China, right? You got to give people incentives not to acquire nuclear weapons. By the way, one thing I didn't talk about just because of time is my view on how to deal with this problem, which was politically unworkable, like most of my views. But my view on how to deal with this problem was, after the JCPOA was signed, we should have gone to great lengths, we the Americans, to form or to establish some sort of rapprochement or détente with the Iranians and pulled the Israelis along with us. In other words, take our gun sights off Iran, reduce their incentive to acquire nuclear weapons. You understand that when you start talking about attacking Iran, you give them greater incentive to get nuclear weapons than is otherwise the case. So I would have coupled success with the JCPOA with a policy of rapprochement, all for the purpose of reducing, maybe greatly reducing their incentives to get nuclear weapons. But both the United States and especially the Israelis are just so hard line on Iran that you can't get out of the batter's box, much less get to first base making that argument.
Thank you. So my question is about if you could describe what exactly the difference in the relationship between Israel and Iran's kind of nuclear antagonisms and, say, the US and China or the US and Russia. Like the two are global superpowers. Israel and Iran are regional big players and have a kind of historical antagonism. And perhaps some of that is tied to Israel's own domestic problems, right? I don't think China has a major interest in what goes on domestically in the US, but Iran, it seems, perhaps has an interest in what's going on in Israel in terms of what's in the West Bank or Gaza. So how does that affect, like, the international and domestic planes intersecting the relationship?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. Just putting the domestic politics aside for the moment, and just comparing the Israel-Iran situation with the US and the Soviets in the Cold War, and let's say the US and the Chinese, or even the US and the Russians today, Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. That's one big difference. But let's hypothesize a situation where Iran does have nuclear weapons, and let's hypothesize a situation where they have a survivable nuclear deterrent. I'd say, leaving aside domestic politics, there's not a lot of difference at all. You have, let's just go to the two great power dyads, so to speak, US and Soviets, US Russians, US Chinese. You have great powers that are engaged in serious security competition. Crises break out, and they have nuclear weapons. And this is a very dangerous situation. Again, I'm old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Cuban Missile Crisis, it was scary at the time. In retrospect, it's even scarier when you read the internal documents, right? You had two guerrillas armed to the teeth with thousands of nuclear weapons and all sorts of places around the planet where they could have got into a fight. And just to take the Russian case, Ukraine, the war in Ukraine starts February 24th, 2022, okay? The Russians actually do very poorly in 2022. The tide turns in the Russians' favor early in 2023. I could walk you through how that happens, okay? But 2022, the second part of 2022, fall of 2022, late summer, early fall of 2022, the Russians suffered two significant defeats in Kherson and Kherson and what was the other one? Kharkiv, right? Kharkiv and Kherson, right? They suffer two significant defeats. And the Russians are beginning to think about using nuclear weapons. We now know that, okay? And Biden is well aware that he's got to be very careful how far he pushes the Russians. This is why he won't give them ATACMS missiles for a long time. It's why they won't give them F-16s for a long time. They're really scared. Those guys have nuclear weapons, talking about the Soviets, the Russians. The Chinese, South China Sea, Taiwan, East China Sea, down the road. Ugh. So I think Iran versus Israel is not that different, assuming they both have survivable nuclear deterrents. In terms of domestic politics, I don't think domestic politics matters very much in this case. I think it's basically the strategic interaction. I think in the Israeli case, there is an unhealthy dose of paranoia, which makes me very scared about how they would act in a crisis. In the wake of October 7th, you saw this, right? And I think in Iran, I went to Iran in 2018. Not many people go to Iran. I was in Iran in 2018. There's more than a healthy dose of paranoia there too. And you get into a crisis, right? And especially if you don't have survivable nuclear deterrents on both sides, and you have two countries that think they're on the edge, right? The potential for trouble is very great.
Thanks, Professor. I have a quick question. Do you think that an Iranian, nuclear arsenal would really change the relationship between Israel and Iran substantially, given that they're already sort of locked in a Cold War situation where they occasionally, dramatically throw missiles at each other to no great effect, but Iran already carries out most of its aggressive actions through non-state proxies. Anyways, but it sort of already looks like the U.S.-Soviet Cold War did. So do you think it's going to change anything?
Yeah, I think the answer is no. And, it gets to my answer to the young woman's question a minute ago. We were hypothesizing, in my response to her, we were hypothesizing a situation where Iran has nuclear weapons. And that's the situation that you're describing. I think it's fair to say that Israel and Iran are mortal enemies. And there's hardly any chance that this situation is going to change. I believe if there was no Israel lobby, the United States would move in here and fix this situation, but the lobby makes it almost impossible. So they're going to remain mortal enemies. The Iranians are going to continue to support Hezbollah. They're going to continue to support Hamas. They're going to do what they can to regain their influence in Syria. They're going to continue to support and, in fact, increase their support of the Houthis. They're going to give the Houthis more sophisticated drones, more sophisticated missiles, maybe hypersonic missiles. Those are missiles that can not only cause huge trouble in the Red Sea, slowing down shipping in the Red Sea, but can also directly hit Israel. So this is a real problem from the Israeli point of view. And then, of course, the Israelis are going to be going to great lengths to cause all sorts of trouble for the Iranians everywhere they can. One of the principal reasons the Israelis were so committed to undermining Assad in Syria is because Syria under Assad was the conduit through which armaments from Iran went to Hezbollah. And the Israelis are ecstatic now, as you could understand, that Hezbollah no longer has that conduit. So all sorts of games are being played by the Iranians to figure out ways to get around that. But no, your basic point, I think, is correct. Unfortunately, let's hope you're wrong and I'm wrong. But I think once Iran gets nuclear weapons, if it does, the competition is going to be as fierce as ever. My point was, I think Iran and the United States will be reluctant to attack the homeland. That's the one thing that will change. It's reluctant to attack the homeland, but otherwise they'll be at each other's throats. And this gets back to the point that I was making to this young woman. Crises seem inevitable to me. It's like the U.S.-China competition. This one's probably going to play out over the next 30 or 40 years. I'll be in the ground, so you'll have to tell me what happened. But I find it hard to believe that you won't have a serious crisis or two. And then the question is, can you manage your way out of it? We managed our way out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think we were so spooked by the Cuban Missile Crisis that, we went to great lengths to make sure we didn't get into another one of those. But, who knows for sure? And this all gets back to the point that I made to you folks at the very beginning about, do you want to live in a world where states have nuclear weapons, or do you want to live in a world where there are no nuclear weapons? And what you really want to think about, and this is a really important point, you want to think about what the world would look like today if we didn't have nuclear weapons, right? Again, I'm not making the argument that it would be good to do away with nuclear weapons. You can make that argument. And if I had to make it, I could make a powerful case for it. But I can make a powerful case on the other side as well. But, we're in a multipolar world. We have three great powers in the system, all sorts of potential for trouble among them, number one. And then we've got countries like North Korea. We have countries like Iran. And, we have all these middle range powers, Iran being one, Turkey being another, who are all throwing their weight around in all sorts of ways. So there's a lot of potential for trouble. And I think absent nuclear weapons, it'd be a more dangerous world.
Hi, Professor. So my question is that personally, I believe that either arm control or nuclear control highly relies on large countries' collaboration, especially U.S. using its hegemony power to restrict those smaller countries. So, and we also seen that Ukraine gave up its nuclear power, and that it apparently doesn't turns out very well for Ukraine. So, in the future, we know that Trump is retreating from many of the international collaboration or contract. Do you think this would incentivize more smaller countries to engage in nuclear power? Because like U.S. would lost interest in restricting them, and also the previous contract apparently doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah. Two sets of excellent questions, and let me take the last set first. You talked about Trump pulling back the United States from various commitments, and you talked about the fact that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in 1993 or 1994, and look at what's happened to Ukraine. And your question is, does that incentivize other countries? There's no question, if you look at what happened to Ukraine, if you look at what happened to Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, we told Colonel Gaddafi, he had a nuclear weapons program. He didn't have the weapons. We told Colonel Gaddafi, give up your weapon, your nuclear weapons program, and we will leave you alone. How well did that work out? Right? Not well at all. Colonel Gaddafi was a fool. He should have never given up his nuclear weapons program. And I don't know if you know this, but I'm probably the only person in the West, the only person who said Ukraine should not give up its nuclear weapons, right? But anyway, the message that is now being heard around the world is it's nice to have a nuclear deterrent, right? Coming from a slightly different angle. Trump starts to pull back. The incentives for our allies to go get nuclear weapons is very great. The South Koreans, right? During the Cold War, I don't know if you know this, during the latter part of the Cold War, South Korea and Taiwan began to go down the nuclear road. Taiwan wanted nuclear weapons. Are you surprised? You shouldn't be. South Korea wanted nuclear weapons. Are you surprised? You shouldn't be. But the point is, you start to pull out, right? And the incentive structure for countries like Germany begin to change drastically. Germany doesn't need nuclear weapons today because it has Uncle Sam sitting on top of it. It's part of NATO. And we provide nuclear deterrence. It's the American nuclear umbrella. Same thing is true for Japan. I'm Japan, I'm South Korea. I see Donald Trump, the way he treats allies, talking about retreating from this place or that place. Boy, I start thinking about nuclear weapons, right? So that's a real problem there.
Colin Powell's standard for the United States military was to be ready for 2 major regional contingencies. And I think that a lot of strategists might be thinking right now that the United States can't both economically contribute to fighting to a stalemate in Ukraine while also fighting 1 or 2 wars in other parts of the world. So my question is, if the United States and China get into a war over Taiwan, how does the United States being spread too thin already affect what you think would then happen in the regional conflict between Israel and Iran when it comes to nuclear proliferation?
Well, just at a very general level, the United States really cares about 3 areas of the world: Persian Gulf, Europe, and East Asia. And it cares about East Asia and Europe because that's where the other great powers have historically been. Those are the 2 most important areas of the world. And we care about the Gulf because that's where the oil is, and oil really matters to us. And our goal has always been to make sure that no one country controls all the oil. We're not deeply involved in the Middle East because of Israel for strategic reasons. If anything, Israel is a strategic liability. It's not even a strategic asset. We're deeply involved in the Middle East / Persian Gulf because that's where the oil is. That's what we really care about. The problem that we face today is that historically, Europe has been the most important area of the world for us, and East Asia has been either the second most or third most important area of the world for us. For the first time in our history, go back to 1783 and march forward to 2017, Europe was the most important area of the world because the European great powers were more powerful than the Asian great powers. And the Soviet Union, which was a Eurasian great power, had most of its military might in Europe, not in Asia. A fundamental shift that most Americans have not understood has taken place. Asia is now, East Asia is the most important area of the world, and Europe is actually the 3rd most important area of the world. The Gulf is the 2nd most. I won't go through why that's the case. Okay, this is why Hillary Clinton said in 2011, we're pivoting to Asia. And you always want to remember, when you pivot to some place, you pivot away from another place. And the main place we were pivoting away from was Europe. But what happened is we ended up in this awful war in Ukraine. I mean, we're not doing any of the actual fighting, but we are deeply involved. Huge amounts of resources are being expended there. And furthermore, we're now up to our eyeballs in alligators in the Middle East. You want to remember that about 2 weeks before October 7th, Jake Sullivan, who is Biden's national security advisor, was gloating about the fact that he had never seen the Middle East so peaceful. right? Today, oh my God, right? So just to get to your question, so we have this very tricky situation where we have limited resources. You know, there's no such thing as infinite resources in this world. We have limited resources, and we're pinned down in Europe, and we're pinned down in the Middle East, and we can't fully pivot to East Asia. Now, if you look at what Trump has been saying, you look at what the Secretary of Defense said on February 12th in Brussels, you look at what Vance said on February 14th in Munich, they're not just talking about pulling out of Europe and putting huge cracks in the transatlantic alliance. They're talking about pivoting to Asia. They want to pivot to Asia, right? So you're going to see over the next couple of years us move away from Europe towards Asia. And that's because we are actually in trouble in East Asia. There are a lot of people who say the Chinese are in quite good shape today vis-a-vis the United States because we've not paid enough attention to East Asia because of Ukraine and the Middle East. But your question had to do with the Middle East. I don't think we can pivot away from the Middle East, mainly because of Israel and our attachment to Israel. And what we have to do, and I think Trump is interested in doing this, is do everything we can to shut down these various conflicts so that we can take our focus off the Middle East as well as Ukraine and look at China. But as you look at the Middle East, I don't see us reducing our commitment there. The Palestinian problem is not going to go away, right? It's not going to go away anytime soon. It's a front burner issue. It's going to remain on the front burner. And nobody has any solution for fixing the problem. And indeed, all the solutions, including Trump's idea that you were referring to, is just going to make a terrible situation even worse. And then there's the Iran problem, which we talked about before, and the Hezbollah problem. Hezbollah is not going away. Here in the Western media, we're told that the Israelis decimated Hezbollah. They're weakened. They're basically knocked out. The former Israeli defense minister, Yoav Gallant, issued a tweet about 2 weeks ago. I have it if anybody's interested. He said all this talk about how we defeated Hezbollah is ridiculous. We had remarkably little success against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And yeah, we killed a number of their leaders, but they have lots of leaders. We've killed their leaders before, and they replaced their leaders, right? So decapitation just doesn't buy you very much. So Hezbollah is still there. There's big problems in southern Lebanon. The Israelis won't get out of southern Lebanon. The Lebanese government is asking them to get out and so forth and so on. Syria is a mess. And the Houthis are not to be underestimated. The Houthis, have proven just how tough they are. And as I said before, they'll be further armed. So I don't see us getting out of the Middle East anytime soon in any meaningful way. I think it's Ukraine and Europe where there may be some reduction.
If Iran were to leave nuclear weapons like they're manufacturing, do you think Israel would still view it as an existential threat?
It's a very interesting question. If Iran gave up on nuclear weapons, let's say the Iranians agree to get rid of the reprocessing capability they have and the enrichment capability, and they sign some sort of agreement on proliferation where they can have they allow for really significant IAEA inspections of their nuclear sites. That's consistent with what you said. Would Israel still view Iran as a mortal threat? I don't think Israel would view Iran as an existential threat, because Iran would not have the capability to destroy Israel. You want to think about Iran with nuclear weapons versus Iran without nuclear weapons. It's a categorically different situation, right? Because they're nuclear weapons, right? I mean, you want to think, there's Russia out there. They can turn our country into a smoking, radiating ruin, right? They have just all those nuclear weapons. And Iran in a scenario where it has nuclear weapons could do that to Israel. That is an existential threat. However likely you think it is that Iran would use those nuclear weapons, you take that off the table. I don't think Israel would see Iran as a mortal threat. But you still would have an intense security competition, and they would see Iran as a truly serious threat, just like you have today, right? So I think the Israelis and the Iranians are destined to be adversaries. And as I said before, I think the only thing that could change that is if the American policymakers didn't have to deal with the lobby. By the way, if you read the chapter, Steve Walt and I wrote the book, of course, on the Israel lobby. I wrote the first draft of the chapter on Iran. And if you go back and just page through that chapter on Iran, the Iranians in the 1990s tried on a number of occasions to have a rapprochement with the United States. And Bill Clinton actually took the bait, and Bill Clinton wanted to improve relations with Iran, but the lobby moved in and killed it almost immediately.
Thank you for this talk. Regarding the Israel lobby, I was wondering if you could talk about where the power of that lies today, and if you can measure, say, between AIPAC, which is, we often sort of talk about AIPAC a lot, and other groups that maybe I don't even know the name of, but I'm thinking of evangelical Zionist groups, and how you measure the power between these various pieces of the lobby.
Yeah. Well, the argument that Steve and I make in the book is that the lobby it's a loosely organized group of individuals and organizations like AIPAC that work over time to make sure that the United States supports Israel unconditionally. And those last few words are very important. The goal is to get the United States to support Israel unconditionally. As you know, any two states sometimes have the same interests, and sometimes they have different interests. And when they have different interests, the lobby goes to great lengths to make sure that the United States supports Israel. And it is a remarkably successful lobby. And it has to do with the fact that it is comprised of very smart and very clever people who are profoundly dedicated to getting the United States to protect Israel. And the United States political system, this is no great insight on my part, all sorts of people have written about this. The United States political system is set up so that lobbies or interest groups can wield huge amounts of influence. You've heard of the National Rifle Association, the AFL-CIO, there's a Cuba lobby. All of these interest groups wield great power in the American political system. And the fact is that the Israel lobby, I think, is by far the most powerful interest group. And it is because it is so well organized, it includes such smart people, and it has lots of resources, including money that it uses to influence elections. There's nothing illegal about this, right? There's nothing immoral about this. It's the way American politics works. You could make certain arguments that organizations like AIPAC should be treated as lobbies that are representing a foreign government. That's not the case. You can make that argument, but it's not treated as an organization that represents a foreign government. So what it does is perfectly legitimate, and it's just highly effective. Just one further point on this. I mean, the people in the lobby think they're doing Israel a big favor, right? They think that getting the United States to support Israel unconditionally is good for Israel. I actually believe the opposite. I believe the lobby is Israel's greatest enemy. And my main point to illustrate that, I can't go into this in great length, has to do with the two-state solution, right? I think Israel's only hope for living peacefully with the Palestinians is to have a two-state solution. You all understand there are probably about 750,000 there are about 7.3 million Israeli Jews and 7.3 million Palestinians, roughly. So you have rough equality. This is inside Greater Israel. Greater Israel is Gaza, West Bank, and Israel before 1967. We used to call it Green Line Israel. Israel from 1948 to 1967, plus Gaza, plus the West Bank. That's Greater Israel. And there are about 7.3 million Palestinians, 7.3 million Jews. So the question is, what kind of political order do you create in that world if you're Israel? And you really have four choices. The first is you could have a real democracy. But if you have a real democracy, you're not going to end up with a Jewish state. It's the end of the Zionist dream, right? So there's no way the Israelis would move to a true democracy. The second option is a two-state solution, which is in the West Bank and in Gaza, you create a Palestinian state, and the capital is East Jerusalem. Now, every president since Jimmy Carter pushed the Israelis hard, some pushed harder than others, to move to a two-state solution. And this, people like Jimmy Carter, people like George H.W. Bush, people like Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, they all pushed hard for a two-state solution. Barack Obama, why did they do that? Because they thought it was the best solution for Israel. And I think it was, underlying the word was, the best solution for Israel, okay? But we never even came close. And the reason is the lobby. No American president could put any meaningful pressure on Israel to move to a two-state solution. And the Israelis were not seriously interested in a two-state solution. I know the conventional wisdom is that they really wanted one. It was just those evil Palestinians who wouldn't accept a two-state solution. This is nonsense, right? The Israelis did not want a two-state solution. There were some Israelis who did. If we could have pushed hard on the Israelis, we meaning the United States, we might have gotten that outcome. And I think that was the one solution. What's the third alternative? The third alternative is apartheid. And basically what you have in Israel today is an apartheid state. And for anybody who thinks this is not the case, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and B'Tselem, these are three of the most prestigious human rights organizations in the world, and B'Tselem is an Israeli human rights organization, have written lengthy reports describing why Israel is an apartheid state. And if you go to Israel, many Israeli elites talk about Israel as an apartheid state. You can't use that word here in the United States because people will say you're an anti-Semite. But in Israel, many Israeli leaders refer to Israel as an apartheid state. So what you have today is an apartheid state. What's the fourth solution, or the fourth way of organizing your society? It's ethnic cleansing, right? 7.3 million, drive those 7.3 million Palestinians out. This is what's going on in Gaza. The Israelis know full well you cannot militarily defeat Hamas. So what they're doing is trying to drive the Palestinians out. That's why they think what Trump said was manna from heaven, not because they wanted the United States to own Gaza, but because he was legitimizing ethnic cleansing, right? But you ethnic cleanse because you have an apartheid state. The Israelis are fully aware of what happened to South Africa, right? You do not want a country that's increasingly identified as an apartheid state. That kind of rhetoric was not used 10 years ago. Now that rhetoric is used. So they got to get out of that box. And ethnic cleansing, in my opinion, is the solution to the apartheid problem, or they think is the solution to the apartheid problem. I don't think it's going to work, and at least I hope it doesn't work. But the end result, you have this apartheid system. I think the Israelis would be much better off had they moved to a two-state solution. It would have been very tricky. I don't want to underestimate it. And as a good realist, I could tell you some of the real problems with a two-state solution. But it was the best of four alternatives. And in international politics, as I often say, you're picking among or choosing among lousy alternatives. And the two-state solution was the best lousy alternative from Israel's point of view, in my opinion. But no president could get anywhere in terms of pressuring Israel to move to two states. And remember, Jimmy Carter wrote that book. I forget what the title of it was, but it had the word apartheid in it. Apartheid or democracy, or apartheid or two-state solution. That's what he was getting at. But he got crucified for using the word apartheid. Oh my God, right? This is horrible. But that's where you end up today. Anyway, I could go on and on about this, but that's basically what the lobby is, what it does, and my bottom line on whether it does good or bad.
Okay, so yeah, we're at time. Thank you, Professor Mearsheimer.
Thank you.